to welcome you to the White House today for an event on conflict-related sexual violence. We're fortunate to be joined by so many leaders, experts, and survivors in the room today and watching online who are longtime partners in our shared effort to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence whenever and wherever it occurs. Among these are our courageous and esteemed panelists, who you will hear from shortly. Sheryl Sandberg, who has used her voice to advocate for support and justice for survivors, global leaders, and US government officials who have championed this work across our government for decades, including Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schaak, Ambassador at Large to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, Cindy Dwyer, and Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt. In the Biden-Harris administration, the fierce and consistent commitment to addressing conflict-related sexual violence and advancing gender equality and equity comes from the very top of our government. Vice President Harris began her career in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, where she specialized in prosecuting sexual assault cases and defending the rights of women and children. Within her very first year as Attorney General of California, she eliminated the rape kit backlog of more than 1,000 cases in state labs. In addition to major prosecutions for human trafficking, as Attorney General, she prioritized victim support services for survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking. And she established the Bureau of Children's Justice to better protect children from exploitation, including human trafficking. As Senator and as Vice President, she has continued this leadership nationally and internationally, working to ensure that conflict-related sexual violence and promoting the status of women and girls remains at the forefront of our national security policymaking. I'm grateful for her leadership and her commitment to advancing justice and accountability for all. And now it is my great honor to welcome to the stage the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris.
Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. What an extraordinary group of leaders I see. It's so good to be with everyone, and thank you. And thank you to Jen. She has been, just like we are just doing this thing together, Jen. And you have been so wonderful. You have been such a power in our administration on fighting for gender equity. And I thank you for that and for the introduction. And to all of our distinguished guests, thank you for being here. I especially thank the survivors and advocates that are with us today. Kolbiasa, Alexandra, Amit, and Nadia, whose Nobel Peace Prize on the topic of sexual violence is an extraordinary testament to her global leadership. Every day, each of you brings to light the atrocity of conflict-related sexual violence. You, in particular, are fearless advocates in the fight for justice, and you remind us of the resilience of survivors. President Joe Biden and I stand with you in solidarity and with all the survivors around the world. So sexual violence has been a tactic of war since ancient times. Throughout history, those who have waged war have specifically targeted and violated women and girls to exert dominance and power over their bodies and to humiliate and terrorize and subdue entire populations. And sexual violence remains a gruesome part of modern conflict around the globe. In Ukraine, Russian forces have raped women in occupied territories. In Iraq, when ISIS seized territory a decade ago, they forced women and girls into sexual slavery as they massacred thousands. In Sudan, the ongoing conflict includes paramilitary forces terrorizing women and girls through sexual violence. In Haiti, gangs have used sexual assault to rape and coerce communities into submission. And we've seen similar horrors in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, Central African Republic, and the DRC. My heart breaks for the trauma and pain inflicted in each of these conflicts. And October 7, last year, Hamas committed horrific acts of sexual violence. Cheryl, I thank you for all your work to bring to light the horrors of this issue and for your film about what happened on October 7. In the days after October 7, I saw images of bloodied Israeli women abducted. Then it came to light that Hamas committed rape and gang rape at the Nova Music Festival. And women's bodies were found naked from the waist down, hands tied behind their back, and shot in the head. I've heard the stories from a former hostage of what she witnessed and heard in captivity. And I just met with Amit, a survivor who has bravely come forward with her account of sexual violence while she was held captive by Hamas. These testimonies, I fear, will only increase as more hostages are released. We cannot look away, and we will not be silent. My heart breaks for all these survivors and their families, and for all the pain and suffering over the past 8 months in Israel and in Gaza. We are deeply concerned by all reports of sexual violence and degradation, and we mourn every innocent life lost in this conflict. It is devastating, which is why President Biden and I have made clear Hamas needs to accept the deal that is on the table for a ceasefire, which would bring the hostages home and lead to a permanent end to hostilities. Specifically, on the issue of conflict-related sexual violence. In recent years, the international community has made great progress on recognizing that it is an attack on peace, stability, and human rights. And the United States has been proud to lead the way at the United Nations and around the world by providing rape kits and health care for survivors, training militaries and peacekeepers, and supporting the appointment of a special representative to the UN Secretary General to monitor this issue. But that is not enough. It's not enough. The crimes persist, and globally, our system of accountability remains inadequate. More must be done. And it is the responsibility of all of us, governments, international organizations, civil society, and individual citizens, to actively confront conflict-related sexual violence and to work to rid our world of this heinous crime, and to do what is necessary to hold perpetrators accountable. And it starts, of course, with awareness and acknowledgement. We must speak truth about the prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence against women and girls and men and boys. All of these crimes are too often ignored. The UN estimates that for each rape documented in connection with the conflict, there are 10 to 20 cases that go undocumented. Conflict-related sexual violence must be condemned unequivocally wherever and whenever it occurs. And we must fortify systems to prioritize action. Systems that support survivors, effectively collect evidence, and promote investigation. That is one of the reasons why our administration is launching the Dignity in Documentation Initiative to improve documentation of these crimes. For far too long, systems, whether they be law enforcement or judicial, have not sufficiently addressed conflict-related sexual violence. And for far too long, the consequences then stopped at mere condemnation, which of course is important, but stopped there rather than going to accountability. We have to change that. We must condemn of course, this conduct, but there must be accountability. So we have committed as an administration to move the system from only condemnation to consequences. Thanks to the leadership of our administration, we have made it the policy of the United States to use all of our diplomatic, financial, and legal tools to punish those who commit sexual violence. For example, for the first time, we imposed sanctions based solely on conflict-related sexual violence, including for crimes committed in Haiti, Sudan, Iraq, and the DRC, with the knowledge that meaningful systems of accountability also contribute to deterrence. If one is held accountable by a system that takes seriously the outrageousness of the conduct, it stands to reason that it will serve also as a deterrence to prevent further crimes from happening in the future. The bottom line is, the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war is unconscionable. And any failure to hold perpetrators accountable is a failure to live up to, by all of us, our common humanity. We must agree that in civil societies, there must be outrage that prompts action to address what is happening around the world, and that we commit ourselves to speaking truth about the failures of these systems with the purpose and goal of holding ourselves to the highest standards to ensure that we all prioritize what is right for the sake of the safety and the dignity and the well-being of all people. So let us rededicate ourselves to build a future where women and girls and all people can live free from violence, abuse, and fear. President Joe Biden and I are committed to work with all of you to that end, and I thank you. Thank you.
thank you again so much for joining us. As you can see, we're now going to transition to a part of the program, which is a conversation with the real heroes here today. So Nadia, I would like to start with you. You have been quite clear that calling for action, not just talk, is what we need to address conflict-related sexual violence around the world. Tell us, this is a very small question, tell us why you think this crime persists and what are the most important steps that we can take as the international community to address it?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, from the recent reports that we have seen, conflict-related sexual violence is going from bad to worse because of a combination of reasons and factors, including a lack of action to prevent sexual violence in conflict, despite clear signs before the conflict begins. For example, the world watched on social media actually and on TV as ISIS conquered town after town. They were very clear and public and bragged about enslaving Yazidi women and children. Yet very little was done to prevent that campaign. And as a result, ISIS was able to enslave thousands of Yazidi women and children. And 10 years later, we still have more than 2,500 women and children in captivity. ISIS sold these women and children in markets using social media as platform like Facebook and Telegram. And 10 years later, only 8 ISIS members have been held accountable. And the vice president said, if you don't hold them accountable, then how can you prevent that in the future? With my friend, lawyer Mal Clooney, we have been collecting evidence and working with survivors. And despite all the work that UNITAD has done in Iraq in collecting, investigating in ISIS crimes, if 10 years later we have only been able to hold 8 ISIS members accountable, then how can we prevent this from happening again? What happened to thousands of fighters who joined ISIS from around the world and committed crimes of sexual violence and genocide? Today we see in Russia, here and in Europe, there are threats that ISIS is coming back. They are getting stronger because only a few of them have been held accountable. And if you don't send the message to ISIS and like-minded groups through accountability, you will never be able to stop them. They will come back again. And if, in every conflict, there are always clear signs before any conflict that sexual violence is going to be, used in these conflicts. And if we can prevent that from happening before it starts, that is the most important thing. And I feel like the solution is to improve prevention measures by acting early when we see these clear signs of conflict-related sexual violence, by, putting better legal frameworks and accountability mechanisms in place, by providing reparations to survivors in their recovery. But right now, from the DRC to Ukraine, Sudan, and Iraq, and everywhere in between, we are failing to hold perpetrators accountable. And that is really dangerous because, for example, in 2017, when ISIS was defeated, we didn't know what happened. They just said ISIS was defeated, and the message was not clear. We must look back and we must work together to hold them accountable, to make sure that we can prevent this in the future. And finally, we must expose countries, companies, and powerful individuals who support these groups, because I believe that when we expose these people, because these groups are not alone, and we have seen, my lawyer and I, we have filed a lawsuit against Lavarch that supported ISIS for years by military and financial and military different kind of support. And if you don't hold them accountable, you're not going to be able to prevent future acts of genocide and sexual violence.
Thank you. Alexandra, I'm going to turn to you next. As a human rights lawyer and head of the Center for Civil Liberties, you've documented cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. And I wondered if you could talk about the biggest challenges that you and your team have faced in documenting this violence and promoting accountability.
The first challenge is that we face with enormous amount of crimes, because Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russia deliberately inflicting the immense pain on civilian population in order to break people resistance and occupy the country. And sexual violence during the war has a very hidden nature, because it's a crime of shame. And with this crime, through contract individuals, Russians try to destroy the whole communities in order to save control over the occupied territories. It's like technology, because survivors of sexual violence feel shame. Their neighbors, their families, their relatives, they feel guilt because they couldn't stop it. And other members of community, they feel fear because they can be subjected to the same treatment. And all this complex mixture of shame, guilt, and fear destroyed the social connections between members of community and provide the task for Russia to save the control over the occupied region much more easy. But second challenge is not just hidden nature of this crime, but the problem is that this crime is still going on right now, in this second. While we are sitting here and discussing, Russian troops committed sexual violence against people in Ukraine in occupied territories. And I feel myself frustrated because I'm a human rights lawyer and I have no legal tools how to stop it. Like, the whole UN system of peace and security can't stop sexual violence and other kinds of crimes in occupied territories. So this is a second challenge, that the law is not working. I do believe that it's temporary, but we need time. We need time for us, for human rights lawyers, to investigate these cases and to hold perpetrators accountable. But time for us converted in numerous deaths in battlefield, in numerous deaths in occupied territories, in numerous deaths in deep rear. So let me finish with something which you probably don't expect it to hear from human rights lawyer, but to be honest, more military support of Ukraine mean less sexual violence in occupied territories, which we as a human rights lawyers will be documenting.
Thank you. And Kobasia, as the head of Survivors Speak Out and as a survivor yourself, you've really focused on lifting up the voices of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And I asked you this question earlier today and told you I would ask you again because you gave such an amazing answer. How can we best address the needs of survivors, recognizing that there are survivors from different geographies, background, genders, and a range of other factors? What can we do best to help?
Thank you. First and foremost, I really want to say thank you for having me, and also, my colleague in this iconic house. And it's difficult to top this up. So thank you very much for those that organize, and also really thank you very much for organizing the event and making conflict-related sexual violence something central, something that we need to talk about it, something that has to be in priority in the agenda. Otherwise, survivors left with their own story to deal with and with nobody else, thinking about them. I think touching on the question, I think it is how to support survivors, and especially how to cover for survivor needs. And that's we you go back to understanding who survivor is. I mean, for some survivors prefer to be called victims, some called survivors, because part of being survivors is that you accept that you overcome certain challenges, and then you wanna move away from the past, and then you wanna have that attitude of survivors, because with survivors come so many other ingredient element which give you that confidence that you are much bigger than what is your experience. And some call themselves victim because they feel that they have not overcome yet. They're still surviving. They're still going through the challenge of that they need to overcome. But some other that have not even survived, that passed away, died, and in the process, and those kind of things. So they have not survived. They're still called victim. So by just laying that, you can see the diversity and the complexity of who's survivors, who's calling victim, and so and so. So for you to understand, in order to kind of to cater for the need of all those things, we need to understand in that wide spectrum what are those needs is, and how would you understand those needs. If you want to understand those needs, you have to go to the source. And what is the source? The source are the survivors themselves. The source are the victim themselves. Because then you will understand what is that need of. Me, my need could be different from somebody that has just like a couple of months or few months ago, had that experience. Somebody that like me sitting here, my need could be different from somebody that certainly had the abuse happen and is still living within their perpetrators. Somebody that living somewhere in a rural uh, community in one of those, maybe in DRC or in Iraq or somewhere, the need could be different, and so and so. And to bring those needs into the fora for us to understand, so that is the cocktail of the need, then we need to bring survivors in order to tell us those. Right? That's why the element of survivor-centered approach is crucially important, because then you're talking to survivor directly without any middleman or middlewoman. So then you get from the source what is those need, and the need really vary. So then one service for all does not really work from a survivor perspective. We need to tailor the services in order to then can meet the need of those survivors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you also, when we were talking earlier, you talked about investing, giving resources to organizations, local organizations. And I just wanted to give you a chance to say another word about that.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I think because wherever that I go, around meeting survivors, whether than in Colombia, Kosovo, or any place, there is a grassroots organization or grassroots network of survivors that created by survivors themselves for other survivors. But the challenge that they always face is the resources, because they have to compete with those big organizations, which have the know-how, have the mean in order to secure funding. But the survivors, they don't have those, and so they have the challenge of maybe getting just a small grant here and there in order to do that. But the service that they're providing, that's a service that is really meeting the actual need of the survivors. So how would we cater so that those resources that we put, the aid that we're sending, can also go to the survivors that organize themselves, the organization that is led by survivors and for the survivors. And for us, to do that, there is certain capacity building that need to be also done in order for the survivors to understand how even, to raise funding and to understand what structure they need to put in the organization in order kind of to give confidence to funders, people that providing the resource in order to say, okay, then you have all your house in order, I can support you and all those funding and all those kind of funding that could be really crucially important for the long-term preventions and also long-term solution for the survivors. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadia, can I turn back to you? I would love if you would talk a bit about the Murad Code, which for those who don't know, is a set of guidelines that you announced 2 years ago for journalists and investigators and others to promote greater respect for survivors and efforts to document and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. So why has that been so critical?
So the Murad Code it's really essential for achieving justice for survivors. It ensures that survivors must be treated in a respectful and ethical manner. It emphasizes the importance of informed consent by protecting survivors' dignity and mental health, by gathering legally sound evidence. While it is important to gather and document, conflict-related sexual violence, we must ensure that we do not re-traumatize survivors in the process. And during my discussions with journalists, documenters, and investigators, and others, I try to encourage them to use the code when working with survivors because it's important. And during my trip to Ukraine last year, I met some survivors who were already familiar with the code, and they had some sections of it written on note cards. They knew their rights, and they were aware of the process, and that it's really important because most of us we didn't know. And as Kulbasia said, it's like it is so different, and even though the goal is the same, but conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, it's really different from Iraq. The way survivors, are respected in countries. Women are more educated. But for example, in other Yazidi women and I, when we escaped ISIS captivity, our homeland was destroyed. Our community was displaced, forcing us to live in IDP camps. Those camps are still there, and they do not offer any privacy, making them unsuitable places for survivors to recover and share their stories. And aid workers, journalists, investigators, and cameras flooded these camps. Most of us grew up in small villages. We didn't have formal education. We didn't know about, what were our rights. And most of the times we couldn't even differentiate between an aid worker and a journalist. There were no consent forms in our own language. And that is why I work on the Murad Code to help survivors better understand the process and to make sure that those who are, interested in working with survivors have a guidelines on how to do it, because I know so many people care about these issues. But if you don't know how to approach a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence, you can easily, by one question, re-traumatize her. And there was nothing like the Murad Code there for me and thousands of my fellow survivors in the camps. And Kulbasia and I, we were talking about, the experience. I mean, we didn't have militaries to come and rescue us. We didn't have, people to support us. After our experiences, we were displaced. And so many times we lived in a very, with no dignity. We had to tell our story in order to get food, shoes, clothes for months, if not years. And so many of them are still out there. And years later, when I look back and I'm like, I shouldn't have asked those very personal questions to just get some food. And that's what I wanted to change for survivors, to make sure that, They don't have to tell their stories to anyone just to get the support they need. We should be there and respect their stories and make sure that we do not re-traumatize them. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Excuse me. Alexandra, I'm going to end with you. I think this discussion today highlights how people can be victims of war, but also women have a critical role to play in advancing peace and security. So what advice do you have for those in this room and beyond, other women leaders working to promote human rights, justice, and accountability?
I know a lot of fantastic women from different countries fighting for freedom, for justice, and for democracy. The same in Ukraine. Ukrainian women joined armed forces. Ukrainian women document war crimes. Ukrainian women coordinate civil initiatives. Ukrainian women take important political decisions. Women are in the far front of this battle for freedom and for democracy because bravery has no gender. And through this gender perspective, it's very visible for what we are fighting for, women in different countries. Because even speaking about our example, Russian war against Ukraine, this is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. Because when in democracy, a woman can perform any role she wants, in Russia and all other autocracies, women can perform only a assigned role for her in family and society. And this is a basis for the authoritarian regime because established relationship between people in society always reflect a society idea of what a political power can be. And that is why in Norway, women and men have equal rights. In Afghanistan, women are prohibited to study in university, and in Russia, even domestic violence was decriminalized because once again, it's always just a projection what government itself does to its own people. And that is why women in different countries of the world fighting for freedom, for justice, for democracies, we are fighting for our daughters. We want our daughters have never faced a situation when they have to prove someone that we are also human beings with all human rights and freedoms. And my request will be the following. In this moment, women in Iran are fighting for their human dignity. Women in Somalia are fighting to return children soldiers to the normal life. We can continue this list, but main idea which I want to share that we have to support the fight of each other. Their fight, it's our fight. Women have to support women.
Thank you all. And that is a perfect transition to the last part of our program. So I'm going to invite us to leave, and I'm going to introduce our next speakers. Yes. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the podium Sheryl Sandberg and Amit Susana. Speaking of women supporting women, Sheryl is the founder of the Sandberg Goldberg Bernthal Family Foundation, the former CEO of Meta, and the founder of leanin.org. She is a longtime champion for the rights and participation of women and girls everywhere. But today, she is here specifically to introduce her film, Screams Before Silence, which documents conflict-related sexual violence committed by Hamas. I'm also lucky to call her my friend. Cheryl, thank you for everything you have done to make sure that the voices of those who experience this horror are heard by people around the world. Amit Susana, who you will see shortly in the film excerpt, is one of the survivors of sexual violence at the hands of Hamas, who has bravely spoken out and shared her story. Amit, I cannot tell you how grateful I am and all of us are that you were willing to be here with us today. And I also just want to say before you two come on up that in line with our commitment to the Murad Code, I do want to say that the film that we're about to see has some graphic images, so people should just do what they need. If you need to leave the room, no one feels shame about that. It's difficult to watch, and it's an honor to have you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for this event. With sexual violence happening in conflicts all over the world and women at home having less control over our own bodies than we had a generation ago, your leadership of the Gender Policy Council has never been more important, and we are all so grateful. We're here today to reaffirm a fundamental truth. Sexual violence should never be used as an act of war. Thank you to Vice President Harris for using your powerful voice on this issue. For you, this is not a one-day event, but part of decades of your work for justice for survivors, some of which I saw myself as you were the Attorney General of my state. You broke a very tall glass ceiling, and now you use your office to advocate for women and girls, and today is just one more example. I'm in awe of our panelists for what you have survived, for what you have overcome, for the resilience it takes to get on this stage and speak the truth. All of us thank you, and I want to offer you one more round of applause. Throughout history, women's bodies were part of the spoils of war. It was just 30 years ago, after the mass rapes of the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, the DRC, that human rights organizations, women rights groups came together and said, no, we're not going to allow this. We are going to prosecute rape, prosecute sexual violence as a crime equal to others in conflict. That's why the world's response to each of these conflicts matters so deeply, because it sets precedent for how we treat the next one. This is happening today. As one of our panelists said, right now, as we speak, this is happening in Sudan, Ethiopia, Ukraine, Haiti. I could go on and on. If we overlook even one instance of systematic sexual violence, we are undoing decades of progress believing women, and we can't let that happen. We're all here today, hoping and praying for peace everywhere and for peace in the Middle East. This war is a tragedy. Is it a tragedy for Israelis? It is a tragedy for Palestinians. And as always, it is especially a tragedy for women and children who so often bear the brunt of violence anywhere. The only solution is lasting peace, two states living side by side, committed to peace and prosperity across their borders. And that is what President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Secretary Blinken are working so hard to bring about. No matter what you believe should happen in the Middle East, we can all come together to condemn the sexual violence of October 7th and what we have every reason to believe is still happening to the hostages who are still there. But our politics today, such terrible political stalemate, is helping too many people to turn a blind eye to something they have long spoken out against, and something that should be completely obvious, which is that rape is never, has never been, and will never be resistance, ever, ever. That's why we made this movie, and I'm honored to be here with the team that made it. Eitan Schwartz, who had the idea in the first place, Meni Avaram, who's the CEO of Castina Communications and produced the film, and Anat Stalinsky, who brings such deep talent and deep compassion, both of which you will see in this film. This documentary gives everyone, it's up on YouTube for free, anyone can watch it, an opportunity to bear witness, to hear directly from people who have been released, from first responders, from expert witnesses, hear directly from them what happened. As we hear the stories of women who are no longer here to speak for themselves, we become their voice. We show the world what we are up against. We vow this will never happen again. And we scream after their silence. Thank you all for being here to bear witness, to scream for them and with them. And now it is just a deep honor for me to welcome to this stage one of the strongest women I have ever met in my life, Amit Sasana.
Thank you, Cheryl. Madam Vice President, distinguished guests, thank you for having me here today. I'm deeply honored. If someone had told me a few months ago, while I was sitting in a dark room in Gaza, tied up by my ankle, without being able to move, that I would be standing here today, here before you all, I would have thought that they were all out of their minds. A few months ago, I was in captivity. Captivity is such a big word, but I want to describe to you all what it really means. Being in captivity means having no control over your mind, body, or soul. You have absolute no control over what happens to you. All your basic human rights are taken from you. Even your feelings are completely controlled by someone else. Back then, I had no voice, no choice. I had no control whatsoever over my own life. I knew that my home and the people that I love were so close to me, just a few minutes drive from where I was being held. Yet they felt so far and out of reach. I feared that I would never get to see them again. I thought that I would never return home. But I was lucky. I was one of the few who were released on the last day of the temporary ceasefire as part of the hostages exchange agreement. Standing here today, I realize how fortunate I am to be alive, to be free, to be safe, and to be able to share my story with you. I realize that I could have just as easily still be there, perhaps even killed, with my story being told to you by others or lost and never told. And as difficult as it is for me to speak out, to talk to you about this very private, intimate experience that happened to me, it is far more difficult to stay silent. I don't see myself as a victim. I am a strong, independent woman, and no one can change that. The sexual assault I experienced should never happen to any human being under any circumstances. No one should ever be sexually violated, and there are no justifying circumstances for these crimes. I remember telling myself that no matter what happens to me, if I will come out of it alive, I would grow stronger from it and not let what happened define me. Yes, it will always be a part of my story, but with time, the trauma will subside and these difficult events will empower me. As I said, back then, I did not have any choice. I had to do what I was told in order to stay alive. Now I have a choice, and I have decided I could not stay silent. I must speak about the horrible things that are probably still happening there to innocent women and men. My recovery depends on the rescue of my sisters and brothers who are still there. My wounds cannot even begin to heal as long as their suffering continues. When I was in Gaza, during the first days of the war, I saw President Biden's plane landing in Israel. It gave me such hope and strengthened me, knowing that Israel's best friend was coming to our aid. President Biden's last speech renewed my hope that we can move forward with the deal and release all hostages as soon as possible. And I really, really hope that it will happen soon. Thank you. Thank you so much.
A lot of the bodies were naked totally.
We saw that some of it was sexual in nature, directly targeted sexual violence.
I heard a girl scream and ask for them to stop.
Her face was on the ground and she was raped.
He's dragging her by the hair, and she's handcuffed behind her back, and she looks terrified, and her pants are blood-stained.
She was naked from the waist down, bruises all over her body.
קשרו אותה בנו, כולם היו ערומות, מישהו הפשיט אותם, מישהו התעלל בהם.
They were using sexual violence as a tool of war, of weaponizing women.
They were sent with clear instructions to rape as many, to humiliate as many.
We are ready for the unthinkable possibility of pregnancies.
פשוט הגוף שלך הוא פתוח לכלל. יכולים להעיר אותך באמצע הלילה ולאנוס אותה, וכל הזמן האקדח מכוון לראש.
That was the first thing I feared. Being raped. Being sexually assaulted.
I remember the entire time I was like thinking, okay, you knew it's gonna happen.
It's really happening. It's really difficult to talk about, but it's my calling. It's my duty to come out and talk.
התעוררנו לצבע אדום, אזעקה, כי היו טילים ב-6:28 בבוקר, ורצנו לממ"ד, למרחב המוגן. אחותי הגדולה ים, האחים הקטנים שלי ואבא ואמא שלי.
ואז אנחנו שומעים צעקות, אל יהוד, כאילו הם כאן, הם בבית שלנו. הם מתחילים להוציא אותנו בשיירה.
ים, ואז אני, ואז אמא. גל וטל יוצאים, ים באה לצאת והיא מתעלפת ונתקעת בדלת. ואני משכיבה את ים פה, ואנחנו מנסות להעיר אותה, והיא מגיבה לי קצת, היא מתעוררת, והיא מתעוררת כזה, פותחת את העיניים, ועוד פעם, והיא מתעלפת. שוב, וגם זה הרגע שמישהו מהם מושך לי בשיער, ואז אני זוכרת שפשוט יצאתי. גם אמא יצאה, ואז היא חזרה והיא ראתה שים ירויה בפנים. והיא הייתה אמורה לבוא איתנו. הוציאו אותה, כאילו, היינו אמורים להיחטף כולנו גם עם ים. אבא כבר נרצח, אבל ים הייתה אמורה לבוא איתנו, והיא התעלפה, ואני מדמיינת איזושהי סיטואציה שהיא מתעלפת, ואני ואמא בחוץ, והיא פה לבד, והיא מתחילה להתעורר, והמחבל פשוט בא ויורה לה בפנים. הכל קרה, ב-11:40 זאת ההודעה האחרונה של ים, וב-11:51 כבר יש סרטון שלנו באוטו, חוצים את הגדר לעזה. הסתכלתי עליו, אמרתי לה, אמא, הולכים לאנוס אותי עכשיו, כאילו הולכים לענות אותי, אבל היא הסתכלה עליי ולא ענתה. כאילו קיבלנו את זה, שזה הולך לקרות עכשיו, שאנחנו פה עכשיו.
There were 10 men around me. And my instinct was just to fight, to do what I can. I didn't mind getting killed. I think maybe I preferred that in those moments. I was scared. I was really scared that they're gonna rape me there and that they're gonna drag me through Gaza streets and parade my body around. So I feared that more than being killed.
First thing you see is the terrorist drags Naama out, and her face looks terrified. She's barefoot and in her pajamas, and they're blood-stained. They're grabbing her by the hair, and she's all like messed up, and I'm thinking of her hair, and I'm like in my mind, I'm stroking her hair like I'm always doing, and I'm thinking of what she experienced, you know, until that point. We would like to think that this couldn't be possible, that nobody would harm a young girl. But then you just see it there. They're the one who posted that video, the Hamas.
אנחנו נמצאים פה בציר 232. כל הכביש הזה מלא ברכבים, חלקם שרופים וחלקם לא שרופים, אנשים ללא רוח חיים צעירים שרצחו אותם בדם קר על ידי ירי. אירוע קשה מאוד, כל מקום שאנחנו רוצים, יש גופות על הכביש, יש גופות בכל פינה, בכל מקום. הצורך שלא יתואר.
משטרה, צה"ל! יש פצועים! מישהו! יש לי פה הרוגים. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 הרוגים. יש לי פה שוטרת, יש לי שוטרת הרוגה פה. יש בפנים. אוי, 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 אוי. יש פה מישהו עם סימן חיים, שייתן לנו סימן חיים.
If even one would raise his hand.
שום סימן חיים? מישהו, בבקשה. מישהו יכול לענות?
מה שראיתי שם זה לא ישכח לי בחיים. זה היה טבח נוראי. כנראה באיזשהו שלב גם הם ברחו, רדפו אחריהם והראו להם באמצע החולשה.
We are trained to collect parts or even bodies in hard situations. Now, we go around the world to help. Hundreds of bodies I dealt with. I don't have words to explain what we saw. Everything was ripped. A lot of the bodies were naked, totally.
In your experience, how often have you found naked bodies?
Never. Never.
מה שראיתי שם זה דברים שלא אנושיים. אם זה גופות של בחורות שהבגדים שלהם קרועים, איזושהי פוזיציה, את יודעת, שהיא שוכבת על הגב ורגליים פתוחות. היה גם איזה אחת שאת רואה ממש על פגע של אוטו, מכופפת עם מכנס למטה. אתה רואה גופה של בחורה עם בגדים קרועים ועם איברים כרותים כאילו. אז אתה אומר לעצמך, מה, גם אנסו אותה וגם שחטו אותה וגם ביטרו אותה, מה עוד יכולים לעשות לבן אדם כאילו?
Her face was on the ground, and when I turned the body up to the other side, the shirt was down, and her tights, that she wore tights, was all covered blood. I believe in 100% she was raped.
Why do you believe she was raped?
The bullet was in the neck. So why there is blood and why the shirt is off?
We came to a house. We found her body. And she had nails around her female organs. Not only nails, but different plastic, metal things. She's a woman that's so you can do whatever you want.
כל עץ ועץ פה ראיתי בחורות קשורות, עם הידיים כפות. רצח אותם, אנס אותם, תעלל בהם, פה בעצים האלה. הרגליים שלהם היו פתוחות. מישהו הפשיד אותם, מישהו אנס אותם. החדירו לעברים הפנימיים שלהם כל מיני דברים, כמו קרשים, כמו ברזלים. מעל 30 בנות נרצחו ונאנסו פה. הייתי צריך לסגור את הרגליים שלהם, לחסות את הגופות שלהם, שאף אחד לא יראה מה שאני ראיתי, אף אחד. אף אחד לא יכול לראות דברים כאלה.
If it's okay, I'd like to see some of what you saw.
אנחנו רואים כאן בתמונה אישה שקרעו לה את המכנסיים, ירו בה במפסעה.
As you can see, the body was brutal in different stages. This is a part of the breast.
זו אישה שירו לה כאן, זאת אישה שירו לה כאן.
Over here, and over here, and over here.
זאת בחורה שהיא הייתה ערומה, הרימו לה חצאית, הייתה עד למעלה והיא בלי תחתונים, פגעו בה.
And what is that there?
That's one foot, that's the other foot.
מכנסיים ותחתונים היו למטה.
This is the body with the nails and the parts. When we get closer and closer, you can see the nails.
Oh my God.
אין שתי אופציות של מה שהם עשו.
This is a piece of metal stuck there.
אנחנו מצאנו אותה עם מכנסיים ותחתונים
This
למטה.
is not connected to the body.
זאת אישה שלקחו סכין ותקעו מלמטה, שחררו החוצה.
Oh my God.
I was at the Shura base, which is where all the victims of the October 7th massacre were brought. We realized that women were not just murdered, women were shot in the head so many times that it seemed like there was an intention, an objective to obliterate their faces. And we began to see that some of it was sexual in nature, directly targeted sexual violence. Some came in with no clothing and mostly very bloody underwear.
Did this feel systematic to you?
Yes, it did seem systematic to use sexual violence as a weapon of war, a deliberate genital mutilation of this specific population of women.
הוא מושך לה בשיער, היה לה שיער ארוך, הוא מושך לה בשיער,
ובעצם אני מבינה שהוא אנס אותה, הוא בעצם משנע אותה. כאילו, ממש אני זוכרת את התנועה הזאת. ואז מעבירים אותה לעוד מישהו, והוא חותך לה את השד. הוא חותך לה את השד, הוא זורק את זה על הכביש, הם משחקים עם זה.
הם תפסו שם איזה בחורה, ואחד מהם כאילו אנס אותה. אני זוכר שהמכנס שלה היה למטה, כזה עד החצי, והוא מאחוריה. שוהם שהיה לידי, הוא אמר כזה, הוא דוקר אותה, הוא שוחט אותה, משהו כזה, ואני לא רציתי להסתכל. וכשחזרתי חזרה, כשהסתכלתי עוד פעם, היא כבר הייתה מתה, הוא עדיין המשיך בזה. הוא אנס אותה גם אחרי שהוא שחט אותה. זאת אומרת, יכול להיות שהוא אנס אותה כשהייתה מתה. הם עשו מה שהם רוצים. הם עשו פשוט מה שהם רוצים, הם לא היה חוקים.
دخل أول دار بعدين دار كانت المرأة. بنت يمكن عمرها كان 18 سنة وكان أنا 21 سنة. حطيت رميتها على الكنبة وأخذت هيك نيمتها وشدحت العين وعملت العملية. نمت معها. اغتصبتها.
Why? Why would the Hamas terrorists put sexual violence as part of their remit for this attack?
Using sexual violence as a tool of war, of weaponizing women, sadly as old as the history of humanity. Because when the body of the woman is violated, it symbolizes the body of the whole nation.
While I was in Gaza, I was chained for 3 weeks. I was kept in a really dark room without being able to move. His name was Muhammad. He used to sit on the bed in front of me, wearing his shorts, laying down. I remember I couldn't look at him. I was just like looking away and covering myself with a blanket so I wouldn't have to look at him. It made me feel really uncomfortable. He also kept asking me, do I like sex? Do I have sex with my boyfriend? And whenever he talked about it, I just like giggled and say, oh, come on, stop, trying to change the subject. I knew that he's up to something. I knew that something bad is gonna happen. So one day, Muhammad came and gave me women's sanitary pads. He said, dam. When you get your period, after that, you'll take a shower and you'll wash your clothes. And he kept repeating that every couple of times a day. And the period was just for one day, but I fooled him to think that the period is continuing. So I remember going to the toilet, folding the pads really tight so he won't see that there's no blood. So I did it for about a week until I could not lie anymore. He untied me and took me to the kitchen and showed me a pot sitting on the stove. And I remember thinking, now is the moment. Something, what you thought about is gonna happen. I bent down in the bathtub like this so I could cover myself up, taking the warm water from the pot and put it in over my head. And then I remember I turned around. He was standing with his gun and the gun was pointing out at me. And he was huffing and breathing heavily, and he had a face like a monster, like a beast, like this. So I stood up and held a blanket, the small blanket, to cover myself. And he came towards me and just pointed the gun really hard at my forehead, screaming at me, take it off, and punching me until I could not hold the towel anymore. And he started touching me, and I resisted. And then he dragged me to the bedroom. And then he forced me to commit a sexual act on him. And I remember the entire time I was like thinking, okay, you can handle this. You just want to survive. You need to survive. Your mom, your family is waiting. I just concentrated on that instead of what's really going on. And when he was finished, he went to clean himself up. I got dressed, covered myself up, and I was crying. He came in and he told me, I'm good, Amit, right? I'm good? No, I'm no good. No, I'm good. I'm your friend, right? I remember I could not look at him. I looked away. And then he got really mad. He closed the door, and I was in that room in complete darkness. Then he came in again and asked me, food? Food? I'm good, right? I'm good. Food? And I realized that if I say no, he's gonna punish me again. So I said, yeah, food. And that's the worst part, that I'm completely dependent on him, completely dependent on the guy who just forced me to do what he forced me to do.
Of the girls you met, the hostages, how many experienced these sexual advances?
כמעט, כאילו חצי מהן חוו התעללות מינית והתעללות פיזית, ועדיין נמצאות שם ועדיין חיות עם האונס שלהן.
We are ready for the unthinkable possibility of pregnancies and for needing to provide help in very, very difficult decisions that they and their loved ones would be facing when they come back.
I want to shout and talk to the world and let them know what's going on there. If I can help someone, if I can help the people who are still there, I want to. I feel like it's my calling to do so.
When I'm scared of myself, I can't make a sound. And if I'm trying to talk, my head meets the ground. I'm laying right there, chained and unarmed. I wanna be reborn, I wanna be reborn. I wanna be reborn, I wanna be reborn. I wanna be reborn, I wanna be reborn. I wanna be reborn, I wanna be reborn, I wanna be reborn.
By thanking everyone for being here and thanking everyone for everything they will do when we leave this room to make sure that that doesn't ever happen again to anywhere in the world. Thank you so much.